Now, on to Egypt and the COP27 conference. China has taken center stage today, agreeing to assist developing countries with so-called loss and damage caused by changing climate conditions, although the size of any financial outlay has yet to be specified. But China has accused its fellow mega emissions emitter, the United States, of failing to fully engage on climate issues. Well, for the latest out of Sharm el-Sheikh, let's cross over and speak to Arise environment correspondent Leila Johnson-Salamiya. Good to see you, Leila. So what are the top lines that are emerging from that climate summit in Egypt today?
So today is Finance Day at COP27, so that's been the focus of high-level discussions and roundtables that have gone on today. U.S. climate envoy John Kerry actually spoke today, and he said that the United States will do its best to live up to President Biden's pledge of $11.4 billion in climate finance through to 2024. However, his speech was actually interrupted by a climate activist, and guards had to get involved and all of that. A study was also published today by an aid agency called Christian Aid, and this study is getting a lot of attention, Charles. It warns that under current climate policies, which put the world on track for 2.7 degrees of global warming by the end of the century, African countries face an average 20% hit to their GDP by 2050. And that figure could rise to 64% loss to one's GDP by 2100. So that's not great news in terms of the outlook that's coming through with scientific data around COP today.
I could go on. There's been quite a lot coming out, but I know that we're on a time limit, so...
We certainly would like you to go on, but let's circumscribe it a little and focus on the next thing that I was going to ask you, which is whether there's been any progress on that issue of fossil fuels such as gas. As you know, we're here in Nigeria. Gas is a big deal. Countries like Nigeria holding their breath on that one and would like a much more gradual wind down of fossil fuels.
Certainly, Charles. Well, as you can imagine, even though the European Investment Bank and about a dozen other European countries in Glasgow agreed to stop funding fossil fuels, Europe is on the lookout for new gas supplies. For Africa, Africa is on the lookout for investment in gas to support the energy transition on the continent. Now, this is not in the official agenda for COP27 this year. However, as you can imagine, there are several discussions going on the sidelines, but no new news today, I would say, with regards to that. However, climate protesters were outside the venue today protesting or campaigning, rather, against the funding of fossil fuel projects. So that's been going on outside of COP today, which is quite interesting considering the fact that we're not seeing too many protests at COP27 this year, due to a crackdown on protests and dissidents in Egypt.
Well, absolutely. And lots of world leaders, Leila, we know, of course, attending that climate summit and discussing how to make things that are possible, such as more funding, inevitable. How are things looking on that front? And we've got about 30 seconds.
Got you, Charles. So today, South Africa secured about 600 million euros in funding from Germany and France to support its energy transition, which is great news for South Africa, considering they are the 12th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world and the largest on the African continent. The UK also said that it would allow some debt payments, deferrals for countries that have been hit by climate disasters. Austria and New Zealand came forward with pledges as well. Nigeria is also apparently to benefit from £95 million from the UK to support climate resilient infrastructure in agriculture. But most importantly today, the AFDB, the African Development Bank, the Africa Union and partners launched the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa to speed up and scale up financing for green infrastructure on the continent. So I would say those are the main developments that we've seen today on Finance Day at COP27.
Well, thank you very much, Leila. And just to point out that we're actually going to your reports now, which looks in a little more detail at some of those things. Leila Johnson-Salami is, of course, our environment correspondent. And as I said, let's stay with the UN Climate Summit. South Africa is to receive, as you heard Leila saying, 600 million euros from France and Germany as part of an ambitious investment plan to help its energy transition green-lighted at COP27. And Arise environment correspondent Leila Johnson-Salami reports.
Overall, Africa may contribute the least to global greenhouse gas emissions, but South Africa is one of the largest polluters in the world, generating 80% of its electricity through coal. Speaking at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa criticized international funders, stating that they make it difficult for poorer nations to access aid in the fight against climate.
Funding institutions need to transform and change the way in which they fund projects that will enable us to develop with regard to climate change. Support is out of reach of the majority of the world's population due to lending policies that are risk-averse and carry onerous costs as well as conditionalities.
Barely 24 hours after Ramaphosa's address, South Africa, France, and Germany have announced the signing of loan agreements for the two European nations to each extend 300 million euros in concessional financing to South Africa to support the country's efforts to reduce its reliance on coal. Earlier in the week, wealthy nations endorsed a $98 billion investment plan put forward by South Africa for the country's energy transition. According to the World Bank, South Africa will require a large sum of $500 billion to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The agreement comes as developing countries and emerging economies place pressure on wealthier nations to step up their efforts for climate action. Leila Johnson-Salami, Arise News.